Welcome to another episode of our video series of the Philosophical History with Contemporary Critique.
It's good to be back.
It is genuinely excellent to be back here and engaged in this kind of thinking with you today.
Likewise. I've been reflecting on how the oldest philosophical analogies really do remain the most relevant.
We really do.
It's a good reminder that human perception hasn't fundamentally changed, even if our technology has.
That sentiment perfectly sets the stage for our exploration today. We are taking on one of the most foundational and I think persistently misinterpreted narratives in all of Western philosophy.
The Allegory of the Cave.
The Allegory of the Cave from the 7th book of the Republic.
Absolutely. And when we approach this, we have to understand it's not just a story, right? It's not a simple story about prisoners.
No.
It is a carefully constructed philosophical analogy intended to serve as a comprehensive map. It charts out critical issues regarding epistemology, the nature of knowledge itself.
Then more than that.
And ethics, politics, and profoundly, the entire process of what genuine education is.
So our mission for this analysis is pretty straightforward. We are treating this framework as a living template. We want to understand what it means for you, the listener, to perceive reality today, and what radical shift is required for true learning to happen.
Let's start at the beginning then, the environment. Imagine you are bound in this cavern since birth.
Can't move.
Your limbs, your neck, they're fixed. You can only gaze upon the wall directly in front of you.
And behind you is the source of everything, a fire. And between that fire and the wall, people are walking back and forth.
And they're carrying objects, puppets, really. And those puppets cast shadows onto the wall. That is the prisoner's entire visible universe.
And here's the part that I think gets overlooked, the part that makes this so potent for today. Their engagement with these shadows. They are not just passive viewers.
No, not at all. They are actively playing a high-stakes social game.
Yes, the text is so clear on this. Their whole social structure is built on, 3 core activities? All about prediction and identification.
First, they're constantly predicting. They're locked in a competition to guess which shadow will appear next in the sequence.
Right.
Second, memory games. Who can remember the precise sequence of shadows from the last hour?
And third, identification. They have names for these things.
Exactly. Is that silhouette the crane, or is it the stork? And they give prizes, honors, to the prisoners who are best at these 3 things.
It sounds disturbingly familiar. Their reality is just a predictive algorithm based on perceived 2-dimensional sequential data.
That's the crux of it. I mean, because they have never seen the light or the object creating the projection, they have no concept of a shadow.
It's not a shadow of something.
For them, the 2-dimensional outline is the actual material thing. The outline of a horse is the horse.
So if the shadow is the thing, then their entire pursuit of knowledge is just about mastering the patterns of an illusion.
Precisely. And this introduces a really profound philosophical problem that goes far beyond the cave. Causation.
Explain that.
Well, they observe that shadow A is followed by shadow B, and they win prizes for predicting it. But their prediction is based purely on observed habit, on a sequence.
Not on cause and effect.
It is not based on a necessary cause and effect relationship, because they can't see the cause. They can't see the puppet or the fire.
So their entire system of knowledge, even though it's collectively agreed upon and socially validated with, honors and prizes, it's fundamentally flawed.
Because it mistakes sequence for necessity.
Right.
And that is the dangerous part for us today. The starting point of human experience, according to this, is inherently social. You're taught what the crane is by everyone around you.
But that social consensus is built on a communal validation of an illusion?
Think about this dynamic in the context of, modern data science, social media algorithms, political echo chambers. We are perpetually refining our systems to better predict the next fleeting image, believing the pattern is the reality.
Okay, that makes the gravity of their situation incredibly clear. Their knowledge is locked into the temporal, the sequential.
Yes.
Now the shift. If their reality is this competitive, socially validated shadow watching, how? Philosophically, how do you educate them out of it?
This brings us to the core paradox of the Socratic method, the pedagogy of the ascent.
Right.
True learning is never about filling a void. It's not about implanting vision where there is none. The prisoners already have the capacity to see.
So the goal of the educator
Is to reorient that existing capacity toward what is truly real.
But the sources are clear. You can't just show them the puppet and say, that shadow is fake, this is real.
They'd reject it.
They would have rejected outright. The shadow is large and clear, and the puppet is small and painful to look at.
Precisely. That external declaration is coercion, not education. The effective path toward truth has to be internal.
So how do you start it?
The only way to prompt intellectual movement is by guiding the individual into a genuine, inescapable contradiction, a true dilemma. This is reductio ad absurdum. You have to force the learner to sincerely acknowledge that their current, cherished belief cannot be.
But in a world where disagreement is instantly framed as, tribal warfare, how difficult is it to get to that genuine internal contradiction without the student just getting defensive?
It is incredibly difficult, and that is where the art of the educator lies. The text suggests that the teacher must start entirely from the position of the student.
You have to meet them where they are.
You have to take your assumption that the shadow of the crane is the real crane and lead them, question by question, to a place where they realize that their belief, when fully applied, leads to an absurdity that even they reject.
You're using the child training analogy here. The goal isn't just to stop the action, but to expose the logical flaw in the premise itself.
Yes. Forbidding the child from putting their foot on the table, that's just physical restraint. Real education is guiding the child to see the logical impossibility if that action were universally applied.
The contradiction is generated internally.
Internally. I want this to be acceptable for me, but I see a world where everyone does this is unworkable, and I value a workable world. The individual chooses to abandon the contradictory premise,
Not because of fear.
but because of reason.
So the prisoner has to be unchained, turned around, and forced to acknowledge the logical breakdown of their shadow system before they even take that first painful step.
That is the necessary moment of cognitive conflict.
Yeah.
And once they accept that their current reality can't sustain itself, they begin the painful ascent. They move from the visible world
The shadows in the puppet.
to the intelligible world, the realm of the forms or the ideals.
Okay, let's clarify this move to metaphysics. Because when we use the term form or ideal, it can sound really abstract to the modern ear. What is the substance of reality beyond the immediate sensory input?
Well, if we rely only on materialism, the belief that only physical objects exist, we hit a wall immediately.
How so?
If you and I can both agree that an iPhone, a chair, and a person exist side by side, there must be something non-material that allows us to distinguish them, to define them, and to discuss them.
You're arguing for a structural component, something that enables definition.
Absolutely.
Wow.
This is the boundary argument. This structural component is the limit, the necessary boundary that defines what the object is and, crucially, what it is not.
So you can't physically pick up the boundary of a chair.
No, but the chair cannot exist meaningfully without its definable boundaries separating it from the floor or the wall.
So the ideal isn't some perfect ethereal chair floating in space. It's the structural necessity, the definition that lets us recognize any chair, broken or brand new.
Precisely. And the core of that definition is function. The source argues that an object is defined not just by what it's made of, but by its necessary function. What makes a table a table?
Its function as a stable surface.
Right. Grasping the why of the function is grasping the ideal. Our thought process in this view is just the attempt to vocalize and structure that underlying reality.
That transition, moving the intellect from observing temporary material things to understanding timeless, non-material boundaries and functions. That sounds like a monumental task. How does the curriculum in the Republic actually do that?
This is the genius of the educational scheme and the necessity of mathematics. Mathematics acts as the bridge.
How?
It trains the mind to detach from the senses and deal purely with ordered, timeless relational structures.
So it's not about counting apples, it's about understanding the relationship between numbers themselves.
Exactly. The curriculum is a rigorous progression. It starts with arithmetic abstract number theory, focusing on relationships, not counting things. Then plane geometry, dealing with two-dimensional surfaces, boundaries like triangles and squares.
Why the jump, then, to solid or volume geometry? Why is that distinction so important?
It's a crucial distinction. Plane geometry deals with objects you can draw in the sand visible surfaces. Solid geometry forces the intellect to conceive of dimensions that can't be physically contained on a surface.
It requires the mind to internalize a structural reality that isn't purely visible.
It's a necessary step toward abstraction.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. And from there, the curriculum moves to astronomy and harmony.
Astronomy is the study of the ordered movement of solid bodies. It's not just looking at the stars, it's understanding the necessary, constant mathematical laws that govern those movements. It's volume geometry over time.
And harmony.
Harmony or music, which is the study of regulated relationships between sounds over time. This is pure structure. You are studying the ratio and the order of the notes, detached from the emotional pleasure of listening.
So these 5 disciplines, they force the intellect to move past the temporary and toward the universal structure. It opens the door beyond the things you see in the world.
They teach you how to look for the function, the boundary, the necessary structure, not just the fleeting shadow. But here we have to return to the painful human element. The source is stress, the physical pain of this ascent.
The light is blinding. The transition is disorienting.
And the mind desperately tries to retreat to the familiar.
It wants to go back to the cave wall.
Absolutely. When that prisoner is dragged up and finally sees the fire and the puppets, their immediate reaction is denial. They will insist their shadows are more real.
Why?
Because the shadows were clear, predictable, large. The puppet is dim, painful, and it disrupts their entire established social hierarchy. This is where intellect clashes with habit and comfort.
This confirms that the greatest barrier to knowledge is in ignorance.
It's the illusion of knowledge.
Validated by social comfort.
It confirms that, and it confirms the limits of coercion. You cannot force a person to accept knowledge because humans are fundamentally free agents.
You can move their body, but not their mind.
You can chain me, you can physically move me up the cave, but you cannot change my internal framework of meaning unless I choose to accept the contradiction.
If the intellectual shift has to be chosen, this has massive implications for how we conceive of education today.
It leads to a radical conclusion, one that's often ignored in discussions about mass media and universal education.
Which is?
The source material argues very strongly that this process of genuine intellectual reorientation, the move from shadow to form, is not a matter of public or mass education.
Meaning it's not achieved effectively through mass-produced videos or books or broad public lectures?
No. It is fundamentally a one-on-one process. It's the teacher engaged in a dialectic with the individual student, working directly with that specific individual's existing assumptions.
And guiding them to experience their own
inevitable self-contradictions.
Yeah.
That personalized engagement is the only way to achieve true intellectual change without imposing external forced doctrines.
That is a challenging framework to apply in the 21st century. I mean, we are bombarded by information intended for the masses. It suggests that the vast majority of what we consume might at best be better quality shadows.
Better quality, high-definition shadows, perhaps? But the essential conclusion remains. Education is not about giving the person vision. It is about reorienting their existing sight potential toward the most real things.
The capacity for sight is already there.
It's there. The job of the educator is to turn the body and the mind toward the light.
And for you, the listener, who is constantly seeking knowledge and self-improvement, what does this entire analysis tell you about your own pursuit?
Ask yourself, are you engaging in the predictive games of the cave? Are you mastering the social consensus, identifying the sequence of shadows, and winning the prizes in your field?
Or are you actively seeking out the structural contradiction that breaks the sequence?
If this foundational text insists that true philosophical training requires personalized, dialectical challenge, the search for contradiction and function, what does this imply about the structure of your current learning process?
It's a powerful question.
You might be watching, reading, and listening to fantastic material, but are you internalizing the necessary contradictions? Are you merely memorizing the definition of the object? Or are you critically analyzing its necessary function, its structural boundary? Knowledge consumption is easy. Genuine intellectual reorientation requires profound internal effort.
That is the ultimate test. To move beyond the comfort of the shadow, you have to be willing to accept the pain and confusion of the light.
And that includes the painful realization that what you thought was real might just be an illusion maintained by collective agreement. We'll have to save the full discussion of the necessary but often fatal return of the enlightened prisoner to the cave for another time.
Indeed. There are many more challenging steps in the journey back down.